On the 14th of June, 2017, at 54 minutes past midnight, a fire started in a kitchen on the 4th floor of a 24-storey London Council tower block, and by 9 minutes past 1, 15 minutes later, the fire had taken hold in the outside of the building. By 27 minutes past 1, it had reached the roof. The flames did not climb up the inside of the building. They climbed up the outside, in a vertical column from the 4th-floor kitchen straight to the architectural crown that had been added to the refurbishment design in 2012. For aesthetic reasons, because the council's planning department had thought the original design looked dull. 72 people died, including 18 children and a stillborn baby. 129 homes were destroyed. Some families lost 3 generations in one night. Many of those who died had been told, directly or through the prevailing advice, to stay where they were. The cladding that wrapped the building had been chosen because it cost approximately £293,000 less than the alternative, on a refurbishment job that was over budget. The manufacturer who made it, by then known as Arconic, had known internally, since at least 2010, that the product was violently combustible in a fire. Its own salespeople had been warned, in writing, that an aluminum composite cladding system could act as a chimney which transports the fire from top to bottom. The local authority landlord had been told for years by its own residents that the building was a fire risk. The fire brigade had been operating under a stay-put policy that assumed the building could not burn from the outside. And the relevant government department, in the years before the fire, was working inside a deregulatory environment in which a phrase had reportedly been used, by at least one named official, contested by him at the inquiry, but heard by more than one independent witness, when justifying the failure to tighten fire safety rules. The phrase was "show me the bodies." There were, the reasoning went, not yet enough deaths to justify new restrictions on businesses. On the 14th of June, 2017, the bodies arrived. One of them was a 65-year-old woman called Sakina Afrasehabi, Iranian-born, with a medical record saying she should not be housed above the 4th floor in any building where she would depend on a lift to get out. A little over a year before the fire, the local authority had moved her into a flat on the 18th floor of Grenfell Tower. The transfer her family had been pursuing for her had not come through. The cladding around her new home was about to become a fuel. To understand Grenfell Tower, you have to understand what a tower block in the British public housing tradition is supposed to be. A building designed to compartmentalize fire, in which a fire that starts in one flat stays in one flat. The procedural consequence of that design is the stay-put policy. When a fire is reported, residents are told to remain in their own flats, close the doors and wait, and in a properly compartmentalized building, it is the right advice. Grenfell Tower had been built, like most British high-rises of its era, to compartmentalize fire. Then, in 2014 to 2016, it was refurbished, and the building that stood at the end of the refurbishment, despite the same name and the same address, no longer behaved as a compartmentalized building does. The fire could now travel up the outside. The refurbishment was commissioned by the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea through its housing arm, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organization, with Rydon Maintenance Limited as the lead contractor, Studio E as the architect, and Harley Facades as the subcontractor for the external wall system, at a total cost of approximately £10 million. Studio E's lead architect was a man called Bruce Sounds, for whom this was a first residential cladding project, and who had originally specified zinc, by chance choosing, for aesthetic reasons rather than fire performance ones, a non-combustible metal panel that would, if used, have saved the building. When the job ran over budget, the introduction of an aluminum composite alternative came through a small firm called SEP Architectural Facades, whose director G. Blades had a commercial relationship with Arconic, and whose business consisted, primarily, of cutting and selling Arconic's a CM product. Blades introduced Sounds to Debbie French, Arconic's UK salesperson, in October 2012, and the cheaper material, Reinabond PE, was set out as a cost-saving substitute and approved. The Royal Borough's Planning Committee, presented with the option of fixing the CM to the building with rivets or with cassette panels, insisted on the cassette panels despite their additional expense. The stated concern was that rivets, in their phrasing, would become rust attractors and stain the cladding visible from the street. The form of cladding selected on aesthetic grounds, as the inquiry would later establish, was the more dangerous of the two configurations of an already dangerous product. After the cladding samples were ordered, the contractor at Harley emailed Blades at Sepp and French at Arconic to let them know both would be in line for big sales. "All I can say," Blades replied, "is that you will be taken out for a very nice meal very soon." And French wrote back, "Thank you for your hard work and perseverance in putting Reinabond forward. I think I owe you both either lunch or dinner at some point." The internal Arconic record on Reinabond PE, now exhibited in the public inquiry, runs back well before the Grenfell refurbishment. In November 2013, formal testing confirmed that Arconic's cassette panel configuration of Reinabond PE was Euro Class E, a fire classification rating at the bottom of the scale. Arconic's senior management wrote to its sales force across Europe on the 3rd of February 2014, instructing them that the previous, higher classification was no longer to be relied on. The email went to Debbie French in the United Kingdom. At that point, French was lining up a big sale of a CM to a tower block in West London. She did not, by her own subsequent inquiry testimony, tell her customers about the change in the rating of the product. Asked at the inquiry whether she had withheld the information in order to avoid damaging her sales, she answered, on the record, absolutely not. Her account was that she did not believe the new European standards were relevant in the UK market. In May 2016, Arconic's French operation responded to a Strasbourg fire that had threatened an adjacent CM-clad tower block by instructing its French salespeople to systematically confirm in writing that customers required the fire-resistant variant of the panel. The internal email said, "We were very lucky. Fortunately, the wind didn't change direction, but we really need to stop proposing PE in architecture. We are in the know, and it is up to us to be proactive at last." No corresponding warning was ever issued to the United Kingdom market. Arconic's senior management asked at the inquiry why the UK market had not been treated the same way as the French market, said on the record that he could not explain it. The British Board of Agreement certificate that the building inspector at Grenfell relied on to sign off the cladding as regulation compliant was, by then, out of date. The BBA had tried to do a periodic review of it. Arconic ignored multiple emails through to January 2015. The BBA could have suspended the certificate. Instead, it reissued the certificate with what was, by then, a misleading claim. The building inspector signed off Grenfell as compliant on the strength of that reissued certificate. The panels, despite testing showing them violently combustible 11 years earlier, were sold, installed on 129 homes, and signed off. There is a man whose blog should be in this story, because his blog should have prevented the fire. His name is Edward Daffarn. He lived on the 16th floor of Grenfell Tower, and from around 2012 onwards, with a small group of fellow residents, he wrote the Grenfell Action Group blog, a record of the management failures the residents were experiencing inside the tower. The blog flagged missing extinguishers, lack of fire stopping in the new gas riser, problems with the smoke ventilation system, and a long list of operational concerns that the residents could see and the landlord chose not to act on. The most cited post, published in November 2016, 7 months before the fire, was titled KCTMO, Playing with Fire, and it contained this sentence. "It is a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believes that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord." The blog was read by the landlord. The landlord's response, recorded in management documents now in the inquiry evidence, was to characterize the bloggers as troublemakers. At one stage, the management organization considered legal action against the residents who maintained the blog. The escalation paths above the management organization, the council, the regulator, the central government department responsible for building safety, had no functioning mechanism to hear what the residents had written. The blog was not a secret. It was, in the most literal sense, published. It was simply read by no institutional party with the power or the inclination to act on it. Good institutions read their critics. The system above Grenfell Tower did not. There was a precursor, the Lakanal House fire of the 3rd of July, 2009, in a 14-story block in Camberwell, South London, in which 6 people died, including 3 children, in a fire that involved external panels with similar combustibility properties to those later used at Grenfell. The inquest took 50 days. It exposed a series of major failures with the internal compartmentation of the building. Fire doors that failed, a suspended ceiling that circumvented fire breaks, meaning flames could rip through internal corridors, ducts that connected flats, meaning smoke could pass to other flats where trapped residents were sheltering, and legally required risk assessments that had not been carried out by Southwark Council, the landlord. The coroner's Rule 43 letter, recommending a review of the external wall fire safety guidance, was sent on the 28th of March, 2013, addressed to the then Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Eric Pickles. The relevant senior official in the department wrote, in an internal note that has since been disclosed, that the government did not need to kiss her backside, referring to the coroner. She had just spent 50 days hearing how 6 people, including 3 children, had died in a tower block cladding fire, and was asking the government to look at whether such a fire could happen again. The context in which that note was written was a deregulatory policy program that had been stated publicly by the Prime Minister. In January 2012, David Cameron gave a speech in which he said, "This coalition has a clear New Year's resolution to kill off the health and safety culture for good." He pledged to wage war against the excessive health and safety culture that has become an albatross around the neck of British businesses. The mechanism for that war was a regulatory accounting rule called 1 in, 2 out. For every new regulation introduced, 2 had to be cut, measured in monetized cost to business, which was tightened to 1 in, 3 out in 2016. Anthony Bird, who had been responsible alongside his colleague Brian Martin for the approved Document B fire safety guidance until 2012, described the rule, in his subsequent inquiry testimony, as an effective moratorium on introducing new rules. The relevant department, the Department for Communities and Local Government, was headed by Eric Pickles, a Cameron ally and a self-described champion of localism, who, according to former junior minister's testimony, decried regulatory madness when new rules were suggested and branded officials Guardian-reading pinkos. A former DCLG official described the department, in the years before Grenfell, as toxic. Officials were reduced to tears if they presented reports against the accepted deregulatory consensus. In December 2011, Eric Pickles wrote to David Cameron setting out his department's deregulation plans. The list included the fire safety provisions of building regulations, with a promised saving of £25.4 million per year to businesses. In October 2012, the Building Research Establishment, the body whose contract was to investigate the implications of significant fires for government, had its contract renewed with a new clause. The clause stated that BRE reports should not contain any policy recommendations or suggest amendments to official guidance. Recommendations could only be made at the direct request of the department. The expert technical body responsible for analyzing what fires meant for regulation had been instructed, in writing, not to recommend changes to regulation. This is the deregulatory environment in which the cladding was specified, certified, installed, and signed off. the phrase that has, since the inquiry, come to characterize the prevailing official mindset is reported in the journalistic record of the deregulatory environment. The wording, "show me the bodies," was attributed by independent witnesses to officials in the department, contested at the inquiry by the official said to have used it, and corroborated by separate accounts of similar phrasing used more than once. What matters is not the disputed sentence, but the accounting it describes, that there were not yet enough deaths to justify new restrictions on businesses. That accounting is what the department's own paper trail records in the explicit deregulation targets, the BRE contract clause forbidding policy recommendations, and the response to the Lakanal coroner. The night of the fire is a hard thing to write about with composure. I will try. At 12:54 a.m., a fire started in the kitchen of flat 16 on the 4th floor of Grenfell Tower. The initial source was an electrical fault in a refrigerator freezer. The resident, Bihelu Kebed, woke, attempted to put the fire out, failed, and called the fire brigade. The London Fire Brigade arrived within minutes, but its control room that morning was not in its usual Merton base in South London. It was in a smaller, more cramped temporary office in Stratford, East London, where the operation had been relocated. By the time the brigade entered the flat, the fire had escaped through the kitchen window. In a properly compartmentalized building, that should have been the end of it. The fire would have continued in the kitchen until the brigade extinguished it, and the rest of the building would have been unaffected. Instead, the flames met the exterior cladding, and polyethylene under flame behaves the way petrol under flame behaves. The cladding panels ignited, the PIR insulation behind them ignited, and the cavity between panel and insulation acted as a chimney, a vertical airflow path that drew the fire upwards. At 9 minutes past 1 a.m., the fire had taken full hold in the cladding. 18 minutes later, at 27 minutes past 1, the flames reached the top of the building. There they ignited the architectural crown, the curved wing-shaped panels of a CM that Studio E had added to the top of the building in 2012, because the planning department thought the original design looked dull. The crown acted, in the words of one expert inquiry witness, as a fuse, taking the fire steadily around the top of the building in both directions, and from the top down toward the upper floor flats where, by then, the residents who had fled upwards had taken refuge. The London Fire Brigade was operating, as it was trained to operate, under the stay-put policy. Residents who called the emergency line were told to remain in their flats and close their doors, and many of them did. The brigade was unaware on the ground of how the building was burning. The dispatchers were unaware, and the residents, in many cases, were the people who could see what was happening and were being instructed to stay where they were. The initial incident commander on the ground, Michael Dowden, was, in the inquiry's own characterization, out of his depth, and was never given the tools to oversee an evacuation. Andrew Walton, who briefly took over, believed an evacuation was essentially impossible. Andrew O'Loughlin, who took over from Walton, had assumed that the fire was burning externally and not breaking back into the building, an assumption he was later criticized for not making more of an effort to verify. At 2:30 a.m., Andy Rowe took command and decided that the stay-put advice had to be lifted. At around 2:15, in the Stratford control room, Senior Operations Manager Joanne Smith had reached the same conclusion independently after listening to 2 calls from trapped residents. The moment that confirmed the decision came when a senior firefighter present in the room walked downstairs, saw an image of the fire being broadcast on Sky News, the first time he had seen the building externally, and rushed upstairs to tell Joanne Smith what he had seen. The London Fire Brigade's control room, which was managing the fire, was learning what the building looked like from television. One operator in the control room scribbled the new advice on a piece of paper and held it up to the room. Tell callers to put wet towels over their heads, cover their faces, hold hands, and leave. Between 2:36 a.m. and 2:42 a.m., in the 6 minutes immediately after the advice changed in the control room, 5 separate call handlers took 6 999 calls between them. and in not one of those calls did the operator advise the caller to leave. The advice given in all 6 calls remained: stay in the flat or wait for rescue. The decision to lift the stay-put advice was officially recorded in the brigade's incident log at 2:47 a.m., just under 2 hours after the first 999 call, and nearly 80 minutes after the flames had reached the roof. By that point, the staircase had filled with smoke, the upper flats had filled with smoke, and many of the people who had been told to stay put had stayed put. They were now in a building they could not leave. 72 people died. The London Fire Brigade, the firefighters, individually on the night, entered the burning building repeatedly, carrying residents out of flats they could not see across in the smoke. Many of those firefighters have not returned to fire rescue work since. The night belongs to them in a way that does not belong to anyone else in this story. In August 2021, in Milan, a tower block clad in similar aluminum composite material caught fire under similar dynamics. The Italian fire service recognized the fire as a cladding fire, ordered an immediate full evacuation, and let the building burn while ensuring every resident was out. The building was lost. Nobody died. What separates 0 dead in Milan from 72 dead in West London is whether the institution, on the night, can see that the fire is traveling outside the building rather than inside it, and can lift the stay-put advice fast enough for the residents to get out. I have not yet told you the names. Sakina Afrasehabi was 65 years old. She had been born in Iran and had moved to the United Kingdom in 1997, where an old accident had left her with serious chronic pain, mobility problems, and arthritis. The Royal Borough's own housing review, after years of complaints from her family, had ruled that she should not live in a property with more than 6 steps, or above the 4th floor in any building where she would depend on a lift to get out. Her family had been pursuing a ground floor transfer through 2014. The transfer did not happen. In early 2016, the council moved her into a flat on the 18th floor of Grenfell Tower. On the night of the 14th of June, 2017, she and her sister Fatma left the flat and entered the stairwell. They were turned back by smoke. They went upward with others into flat 205, where they sheltered with neighbors who had also fled upward. Sakina did not survive the night. Gloria Trevisan was 26. Marco Gottardi, her partner, was the same. They had met at the Venice University Institute of Architecture, had graduated together in 2016, and struggling to find satisfying architectural work in Italy, had moved to London in March 2017. Gloria had quickly found work at an architectural firm that specialized in the restoration of old buildings. Marco had found work at a studio called Creative Ideas and Architectural Office. They rented flat 202 on the top floor of Grenfell Tower. Gloria, by her mother's later account, missed Italian food and Italian sunshine, but she liked her work, and she liked the view from the top of the tower. She sent her mother photographs of the rainbows over London. On the 13th of June, they had considered flying home to Italy for Gloria's parents' 37th wedding anniversary the following day, but had decided instead to come for Marco's birthday 8 days later. At 1:34 a.m. on the 14th, Gloria phoned her mother in Italy to wish her happy wedding anniversary. While on the phone, she told her mother a fire had broken out in the building. While she was still on the phone, the couple welcomed their neighbors from a few floors below into the flat. Gloria's mother told her to cover her mouth with a cloth and flee. Marco told her, at the urging of the operator who had spoken to him moments before, that the fire brigade had told them to stay where they were. They could see the landing filling with thick, dense smoke. Gloria told her mother she did not think they would be able to escape without help. There are 70 more names. I am not going to read them all. The list exists. It is held by the bereaved families. It is in the inquiry record, and it is etched on a wall near the site of the tower. There has now been a public inquiry, chaired by Sir Martin Moore-Bick, a retired Court of Appeal judge which ran for almost 7 years. Phase 1 reported in October 2019 on the night of the fire itself. The dynamics, the response, the failure of the cladding, and Phase 2 reported on the 4th of September 2024 on the causes and the responsibility. The Phase 2 report runs to almost 2,000 pages, and its summary identifies by name, by company, by role, the parties whose decisions and omissions led to the fire, in the language of a senior judge stating findings without rhetorical flourish. The findings include that the manufacturers of the cladding panels and the insulation engaged in systematic dishonesty and deliberate and sustained strategies in obtaining and maintaining certifications. The certification bodies were inadequately resourced and, in some cases, willing to credential products they had not properly tested. The local authority landlord operated a culture in which residents' safety concerns were dismissed as troublemaking. The central government department responsible for building safety had, over a period of decades, declined to update the relevant statutory guidance in response to repeated warnings, including the coroner's recommendation following Lakanal House. And the London Fire Brigade's response on the night was hampered by institutional failures it had not addressed in the 8 years since Lakanal House. The report uses, in its central passage on responsibility, the phrase "decades of failure." That language belongs to the inquiry, not to me. There is, I should add, a particularly stark fact about how prepared the London Fire Brigade was for what happened at Grenfell. The brigade's own fire safety experts had been developing a PowerPoint presentation on the risks of cladding fires elsewhere in the world, intended to be delivered to building owners in June 2017. The presentation was scheduled to be given just days after Grenfell. After the Shepherd's Court cladding fire in 2016, a senior LFB staff member had written, internally, this could be the proverbial cat out of the bag on this issue. The cat was, as it turned out, already out of the bag. The presentation was simply ahead of its delivery window by a few days. When she appeared at the inquiry, the then commissioner of the LFB, Danny Cotton, compared the brigade's failure to plan for a fire like Grenfell to a failure to plan for a space shuttle landing on the Shard. The remark angered the bereaved and survivors. By the time she gave it, the documents establishing what the brigade had in fact known were already in the inquiry record. The criminal investigation continues. The Metropolitan Police's most recent public position, in May 2026, was that the files for charging decisions would be submitted to the Crown Prosecution Service by the end of September 2026. No charges have yet been brought against any individual or organization named in the inquiry report. If charges are brought, the investigation will already have been running for nearly a decade, and the youngest survivor of the fire will be in secondary school. The Building Safety Act of 2022 has reorganized the regulator. The remediation program, funded partly by central government, partly by developers, partly by leaseholders, continues to be argued over. Several thousand buildings across the United Kingdom remain clad in materials now known to be combustible, and many of their residents have spent the years since the fire waiting for a system that has, on the whole, not arrived for them either. Grenfell Tower itself, draped in white memorial sheeting, was confirmed for demolition in 2025. The site will become a permanent memorial to the 72 dead. The cold open of this episode said that the building was wrapped in a petrol-like fuel load, and that an official accounting that there were not yet enough deaths to justify new restrictions on businesses captured the regulatory environment in which the fire safety rules were not tightened. Both of those things are documented. Polyethylene under flame behaves like a fuel. Grenfell was wrapped in that fuel, and that fuel was certified as safe. The inquiry found that the certification rested on systematic dishonesty by the manufacturer. The certification body did not suspend the certificate when it should have. The local authority's inspector signed off on the strength of that certificate. The landlord dismissed the residents' warnings, and the fire brigade, by its training that morning, was operating on the assumption that none of the above was true. Lakanal House established the warning. The deregulatory program established the policy environment. Arconic's internal record established the supply chain. The Studio E refurbishment decisions established the installation. The KCTMO management culture established the silencing of the Grenfell Action Group blog. The Stay Put policy established the procedural trap, defensible in a compartmentalized building, lethal in a building wrapped in fuel, with a control room that learned what the burning building looked like from television. 8 years after the fire, the state is still writing its answer. Sakina Afrasehabi entered the stairwell at some point after 1 a.m, and the smoke turned her back. She climbed upwards with her sister and with neighbors into flat 205, 3 floors above the flat the Royal Borough had moved her into, and which her own medical record said should never have been hers. She did not leave that floor. Her family had been pursuing a ground floor transfer for her since 2014. The transfer did not happen. None of the layers of the system that was meant to protect her, the housing officer, the certifier, the inspector, the manufacturer, the regulator, the dispatcher, the politician who saw fire safety regulation as red tape, was hidden from any other layer. Each was visible, each was checkable, each failed at exactly the point where checking would have cost money. That is what we wanted to show you.